Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. So it's a long weekend, and after the long weekend, a lot of people are starting to think about what next. A lot of political campaigns get a little bit more earnest, a lot more barbecues, a lot more picnics. People are enjoying the dog days of summer, but starting to think a little bit more about school and work and things. And so I thought it'd be really helpful to check in with Dan Donovan, who is the editor and publisher, owner of Ottawa Life magazine. We've chatted before, and I thought we'd do a little bit of a roundup of a bunch of the different issues that are going on within Canada today. Dan, how are you? Welcome to the show.
Never better. Thanks for having me, Brian. Always nice to talk to you, especially on a nice long weekend, sunny days. Like you said, everyone's enjoying the summer.
You went out for a nice bike ride and got some sun, I take it.
Ottawa is such a great city for recreational outdoor stuff. We have so many wonderful bike paths along the Ottawa River and in and behind Parliament Hill, and just a wonderful, wonderful day here. People are, starting to come out of their shell a bit, but I think the residue of COVID is still there. So but it's still nice to see a lot of people out.
I got to tell you, I was in Florida last week. COVID never happened. It's amazing. In Florida, COVID never happened. And lots of people have got it, but as far as they're concerned politically, never happened. It's amazing the attitude they've got to it. And I was in Texas, I guess, 2 weeks ago, and frankly, a similar attitude. So, Canada, Ontario, Ottawa, Toronto are different. There's no question. But anyway, let's talk about politics to start with. And the Conservative leadership campaign is something we've had a couple of conversations about. And I guess the big news in the last little while is that former Prime Minister Stephen Harper has come out and endorsed Pierre Poilievre. What do you think of that?
Well, it's very interesting, the different reactions to that. The first thing that I thought when I heard it was, why? And let me explain that, because, the narrative has been from the Poilievre camp that they're way ahead and they're going to win this on the first ballot. And so I was thinking, well, if that's the case, why do you need that endorsement? Are you in trouble? Is there a problem? Jean Charest is nipping apparently behind in this race, but still nipping away at it. And as we know, that this is not a one person, one vote race. This is the way the rules work in this race. It's on points. So, for example, a riding in Quebec with 200 Conservative members might have the same value in terms of the weighted vote as a riding with 10,000 people in Alberta. So, Jean Charest doesn't need to get the same amount of voters that Pierre Poilievre has, and the Conservative Party's not releasing these numbers. They're being a little quiet on the details. So I just thought it was odd that Harper came out and endorsed him. I think I don't think Stephen Harper's a fan of Jean Charest, but the party tradition is not to do that. He didn't do it with Scheer. He didn't do it certainly with Aaron O'Toole. And there is a sort of history in our parties here where former prime ministers sort of stay out of the fray. So it's interesting that he came out and did that. But again, my question was, well, why? If you're so far ahead, why would Poilievre need that? So that's, others say, well, it just reinforces this view of the Conservative Party that it's the party of Stephen Harper, and Poilievre is a protege of that. He was a parliamentary secretary to Stephen Harper. He was a junior minister in the Harper government. So this is Harper putting his sort of hand over Poilievre and anointing, his view that the Conservative policies of Pierre Poilievre are the way to go. But he didn't do that with Aaron O'Toole, who was in his cabinet, and he certainly didn't do it for Andrew Scheer, who had been a former Speaker of the House. So it's odd. It's odd.
I'm not sure if you saw it, but Angus Reid came out with a poll last week that showed that Pierre Poilievre and his policies were very positive within the Conservative Party. But within the electorate in general, Jean Charest had the better policies and had more support. And it comes back to the discussion that we've had in the past that Poilievre might find it easier to win the Conservative Party than he will the country, and that Jean Charest is actually potentially the choice of more people in Canada might have a better chance against the Liberals, particularly those blue Liberals that might be very attracted to some of his policies. And, some of the statistics were quite telling that a lot of people that vote Liberal in Ontario and a lot of people that vote Conservative in Ontario wouldn't be choosing Pierre Poilievre, but would be choosing Jean Charest. I don't know if you saw that, and what do you think of it?
Well, I think that's true. I did see that, and I did go through that poll, and it is interesting. And I think it's not surprising in the sense that Jean Charest is a progressive conservative. He's not a conservative in the sense that that Poilievre is or Stephen Harper were. And they had a coming together of that party with Stephen Harper and Peter MacKay's agreement in the early 2000s, where they agreed to get along, and MacKay became the deputy leader, and then Harper was the leader, and he went on to become the prime minister. But the issue really is this is when I talk about, the existential crisis in the Conservative Party, this is the battle for the soul of the Conservative Party. There are those in the party who believe that we go hardcore. We should, they believe they should go hardcore. They should have these conservative values, and that's it. And we're not doing any of this mamby-pamby, middle of the road stuff, progressive stuff. And that's how we're going to win. And we're going to bring in a whole new group of voters that are going to help us do that. I don't know that that's going to work. I also think that whoever wins the Conservative leadership race, whether it's Poilievre or Charest, they have a very good chance of beating the Trudeau government, because, as we know, governments are not voted in. Generally, they're voted out. And I think this government's got the sort of past due date on them. And I think people generally are with this government, this Trudeau government, where they were with the Wynne government back in 2018. They were just saying, like, enough, like, stop, go away, please leave. And I really get a sense when you look at to Poilievre's point, he was critical of the Bank of Canada. He's been consistent on that, on their policy, on their printing money. He's been consistent about the fact that, their job is to keep inflation at 2%. And a year ago, the Bank of Canada said, hey, Tiff Macklin said, nothing to worry about. We're at 2%. Everybody calm down. There's not going to be a problem. Inflation today is at 8.1%. Gas prices are the highest they've ever been. And part of I think the things that Poilievre is tapping into is this anger that I sense with a lot of people, that things aren't working properly, that government isn't working properly, the Bank of Canada isn't working properly for us. And then on top of that, you see things happen like the Bank of Canada, even though they messed this up and they've now admitted they messed it up, they gave out $43 million in bonuses to Bank of Canada employees last year. So there's a problem there. There's also a problem in the federal government. When over COVID, during COVID, federal public employees got almost $1 billion in raises and bonuses. $1 billion. And even though they got that, we did not, and we spent $1 trillion. We have not seen an increase in healthcare capacity in this country. The president of the CMA just a month ago said that healthcare in Canada is collapsing in her view. We don't have the proper numbers of nurses and doctors and frontline healthcare providers we need. So we spent $1 trillion. We've given public servants $1 billion in raises and in bonuses. Healthcare is not working. The passports aren't working. People can't get their passports. They're camping out. The airports aren't working. And then, of course, so Poilievre has tapped into a lot of this anger. And then the response of government is, well, this is happening everywhere. But frankly, it's not. It's just not. And Pearson Airports has a record right now.
So I'm gonna challenge you on some of this,
Sure.
Dan. But we're gonna take a break first to give you a breather so that you can respond adequately to my challenge. But we're gonna take a break for some messages. We'll be back in just 2 minutes with Dan Donovan, editor and publisher of Ottawa Life magazine. We're talking, really about a whole bunch of different issues that are confronting Canada today. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We got a special Holiday Monday show with Dan Donovan, who is the editor and publisher of Ottawa Life magazine, someone who I've connected with a few times to talk about politics and what's going on in Ottawa, obviously from someone who knows it unbelievably well. Dan is a former political staffer. He's someone who knows politics well. I got to repeat it again. He's a former stand-up comedian. The man is funny. He's smart. He's an incredibly well written individual. He writes unbelievably well, and he's a nice guy. And he's obviously a student of politics and current events and knows what's going on. But Dan, I got to challenge you on some of the things that you just mentioned. So first of all, inflation. Inflation is above 8-9% in the whole Western world. The Federal Reserve has just this past Wednesday jacked interest rates by 75 basis points, unheard of in the United States. The European community, the Euro Bank, is going to be jacking up interest rates. The Bank of England has already jacked up interest rates. Inflation is everywhere, and it's yes, certainly impacted by government spending and monetary easing that the Bank of Canada is somewhat responsible for, and clearly the government of Canada is responsible for, but also supply constraints that have impacted the whole world because of COVID and the war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine that has dramatically impacted. And how can you say that the Bank of Canada is wrong, has made mistakes when it's happening everywhere? And I take it. If we had not had the kind of monetary easing that the Bank of Canada had, do you think we could have, given that we're in a globally connected world, actually had a situation where we had inflation at 3%? Is there any way possible that Canada could have had inflation at 3% or 2% when the United States, when England, when the whole European community is up in the 8-9% range? Is that possible at all?
Well, first, a couple of interesting points here, Brian, and I want to preface what I'm saying by, as we both are, I'm an observer of these things. So I'm pointing out, when I'm talking about these things, I'm just pointing out, for example, the things that the conservative leadership contenders are saying, including Poilievre, Charest, Poilievre and Charest mostly, and Scott Aitchison to a lesser degree. I'm just pointing out things that they're saying with regards to this. With regards to inflation, the governor of the Bank of Canada, Tiff Macklin, has actually come out and said he got it wrong. Now, would we have inflation anyways? Absolutely. But would it be at 8.1% in Canada? I don't know. And the other issue we have to ask ourselves is, we got $1 trillion debt in this country. We have not quite 40 million people. We now have $1 trillion debt. And I've said this before the COVID crisis, our debt was about $425 billion. It's over $1 trillion now. And what do we have to show for that? That's a question, and that is something the electorate will answer in the next election. But there is a lingering feeling out there that not only did the bank get it wrong, and they've admitted they got it wrong. Yes, we'd have inflation now, but 8.3%. And on top of that, what's different here is we also have gas prices through the ceiling. And the fact is that the gas prices are up. We've shut down our energy sector in this country under this government, under the altar of climate change, which is a real thing. But the problem is the carbon tax, this very onerous carbon tax they put on everyone, is going into general revenues. So they're using this carbon tax as part of the general revenues of the government of Canada. Instead of it going into a specific file for climate change, it's just going into general revenues. And that's why they're spending like drunken sailors. And so there's no discipline. And so I think what the Conservatives have tapped into in a very real way is people's frustration that things aren't working. On top of everything else, we have inflation, we have high gas prices, we have a minister of finance and a deputy prime minister who just weeks ago was standing at a press event and bragging about the fact that she lives in downtown Toronto and patting herself on the back because her and her husband have 2 kids and they live in downtown Toronto and they don't have a car. And let's pin a medal on her. that is just so not the reality of like 99% of the people in this country who don't have access to public transit, who don't have access to the types of things and privileges she has. And so it just proved how detached most people in this country drive vehicles. They do. That's how they get around. So it's a lack of, as they say in French, sympa with the population. It's like, let them eat cake. Well, no, we're not going to do anything to deal with the gas prices. They've shut down all the pipelines. Why are we importing oil from Saudi Arabia in our country when we can be energy self-sufficient? Why are we doing that? These are questions, legitimate questions that are being raised. And I think when the government is not able to answer those questions, when people say the Arrive Can app, why are we still doing that? This government criticizes China. They claim China is this state that's got state surveillance everywhere. But the Arrive Can app, they are collecting all the data from Canadians on that. They're not telling us what they're doing with it. It is one of many things that are causing problems at the airports. So it's just the inconsistency of policy. And I think these are things that the Conservatives are tapping into in the leadership race, and it's showing in the polls. It's showing that's why they're ahead.
So let's talk about some of these things. So inflation, I think, is a G7, if not a worldwide problem. And I don't think there's any way that we could have bucked that trend. And the US dollar is on a tear right now. It's equivalent to the euro, or at least it was for a day last week. And if Canada had interest rates substantially below the United States, even if we had kept inflation in check, what we would have done is we would have created a situation where the Canadian dollar would have been in free fall. So we live in a globalized world where interest rates have to be somewhat comparable between Canada, United States, Europe, the UK, and inflation ends up being that way. Gas prices are coming down. Gas prices have come down for the last 2 weeks in the United States, and they're going to be coming down.
Hang on. Well, that's a relative statement. I mean, when a year and a half ago, you could get gas for 95 cents.
But as you well know, none of us were driving. None of us were driving, and we didn't have a war in Ukraine, and gas was at an all-time low. Gas was negative during the pandemic. People were pleading with people to buy gas, and then gas went up like crazy when we were in an inflationary environment. And I think one of the mistakes clearly that the world made, and it's interesting because, and Biden's, probably getting criticized the President of the United States more than anyone, but what Biden said, and it's interesting, what he said is, in the aftermath of the Great Recession in 2008, 2009, we didn't do enough, and we didn't do it quick enough. And so therefore, the recovery coming out of the 2008-2009 recession was anemic and took a lot longer. And so what happened is the US, Canada, Europe, the UK, et cetera, all spent a lot more money and a lot more quickly. We did not have, remember, you probably remember this better than anybody, but in the fall of 2008, Stephen Harper was a minority government. He did not want to, even though we were having this great recession, this crash in the United States, Stephen Harper didn't want to have a fiscal stimulus. And Dion and the NDP had an agreement to bring down the government and change the situation. Ignatieff.
And you forgot one thing, Dion and the NDP and the Parti Québécois, the separatists, they were going to get in bed with the separatists to try to displace a minority government using the separatists. And that's why that didn't work.
Yeah, and Ignatieff ended up taking control of the party, the Liberal Party at the time. And January or so decided that they weren't going to do the deal with the Bloc Québécois, and they were going to support Stephen Harper. And Stephen Harper passed a budget or a financial update, can't remember which it was, that was stimulative. Not nearly as stimulative as what maybe
it was $60 billion, and they spent that money over the next 3 years. And then what they did, and I agree with you, it was the right thing to do. In fact, you'll see a lot of that money in community centers all over Ontario, and hockey rinks and little community centers. If you drive around the province, it was that economic stimulus plan that they did. And I agree with it. It was like that John Keynes type of economic thinking where
the learning from that, right or wrong, the learning from that, according to Biden, was that we didn't spend enough, we wouldn't spend it quickly enough. And so therefore, what ended up happening with the pandemic is every government spent a lot of money and spent it quickly and overspent it so long that we ended up having an inflationary environment. And so we got it wrong in 08, 09, we underspent, and we got it wrong in 21 and we overspent. But what we had was a huge comeback, and we've got the lowest unemployment in history right now. You know, unemployment in several states in the United States is below 2%. Like, it's unheard of how low the unemployment is. But that clearly has led to an inflationary environment. So, you know,
hang on. The unemployment rate is a bit of a misnomer, because one of the things you get when you have high inflation is lower employment, is lower unemployment. And the other thing that's happened in the same period with COVID is that we've had a mass exodus of the workforce from people in their late 50s to their late 60s who are not coming back. So, you know, this is a coincidental thing as well, where there's low unemployment right now because a lot of people exited the workforce and aren't coming back. That's what's driving the employment numbers. But when you get to the debt, and I agree, stimulus is a good thing.
Debt is a problem. There's no question. Debt is a problem, and regrettably, no one's been talking about it. And in the last federal election, no one talked about it. Frankly, in the last provincial election in Ontario, nobody talked about it. And even in an inflationary environment, when the Bank of Canada is increasing interest rates to try to slow down the economy, to be giving, to be removing sticker fees on license plate renewals, to be removing tolls on the provincial government and the Liberal government and the Liberal Party and the NDP party were trying to buy votes with policies that made no sense during an inflation.
Which policy are you talking about? The license plate sticker?
Yeah.
Well, I think that was brilliant. I think this shows why Doug Ford increased his seats in the legislature, and it told me that this guy is totally in touch with working people and middle class people in this province, because working class people in Canada, middle income people in this country are under a great deal of stress right now because of inflation, because of high fuel prices, because of, for example, in Ottawa, they got public transit here. The O train is the oh no train because it doesn't work. It's a $4 billion project that was managed by city officials and bureaucrats. Guess who's behind it? SNC. The train don't work. It doesn't work. And so people can't get around in the city. And then when they go to get on the O train on the days it is working, they want $3.75 per ride. It's not affordable for people. And Doug Ford, I think what he tapped into in the Ontario election was the fact that why do we have this license plate sticker thing in Ontario where everybody's got to pay this money? Why are we doing that? Why? And it was a good question. Why? Why are we doing that? So he just got rid of the fees. I see that as giving people a break. And it's the kind of thing he gave a break on the gas taxes. Did Trudeau government give a break on the carbon tax or the gas taxes? No, that's not buying votes. I think it's being in touch with people.
And when you're in an inflationary environment and the Bank of Canada is increasing interest rates to slow down the economy, he's doing the exact opposite thing to which he should be doing. He frankly may not be politically wise, but he should be increasing taxes, not reducing taxes and fees. And what's going to end up happening is the Bank of Canada, the Bank of Canada is going to have to increase interest rates even more than they otherwise would have because of the things the Ontario government is doing in that regard. What he is doing is exactly what Keynes said don't do, which is he's spiking the punch bowl when you should be taking the punch bowl away because the party is going way too wild. What Doug Ford did is he spiked the punch bowl in the end, and he's going to froth it up. And it's the same thing that Stephen Harper did in 2007, 2008, which I think is going to come down in history as one of the stupidest financial decisions ever made. Politically, maybe smart, but stupid financially, is he reduced the GST by a point, 2 points in total, but another point in I think it was January of 2008. Which led to a situation where the Canadian dollar went from something like 95, 97 cents US to 103. And by September, it was down in the 80s. And so what ended up happening is you created this froth in the marketplace. You created a huge amount of fiscal stimulus when we were already over inflated and in a bubble economy, such that the drop is even worse. And that's exactly what I think Doug Ford is doing. So you may be right that he may have bought votes with it and people may have liked it, but it was the wrong financial thing to do.
Well, I'll tell you why I disagree with that. And I think it's something that Pierre Poilievre and others have tapped into. And I think that a lot of people aren't sort of connecting this. We have this sort of dystopian landscape we live in right now, where people are under extreme financial pressure, and but the officials and politicians who are in charge of things have a double standard. And I'll give you an example. The very Bank of Canada you talk about, who are tasked with coming up with our banking policy, as I said earlier, they got it wrong. But in their mind, these people who are making these decisions are supposed to have a certain sanity about them. They think that even though they did not do their job, like in a big way, it's okay to give $43 million out in bonuses to their staff. Then you look at, like I said, I talked about the pay raises and privileges for federal public servants after people have been devastated by COVID and businesses, and they're giving themselves raises. Then you look at the banks. You look at the oligopoly. The banks in this country have never made bigger profits than they have made during COVID. So you've got six key CEOs of banks here that are an oligopoly. There's no competition in banking. People pay high fees in banking for businesses, for mortgages, for investments. They're paying these crazy fees. The bank presidents in this country are on average of $14 million a year. The Bank of Nova Scotia last year increased its profits in 1 year from $6.7 billion to $10 billion in profits. So people, people go to the store and lettuce costs $9. And then so Doug Ford and other politicians are saying, we got to give people a break. We got to give them a break at the pumps. We got to give them a break at the license bureau. And then other people say, oh, we got to tax people more. No, what we should, and the thing is with the John Maynard Keynes and his whole Keynesian economic policy, actually what Harper did, and I agree with you, Harper was dragged to the table in 2008, 2009 to do stimulus spending, which he should have done. But at least by the time he got there and he did it, they spent the money, they took the investments, they invested in communities, they got people working, they got these investments out, and then they took the steps to pay the debt back and pay it back down. There is no focus in this government on repaying the $1 trillion debt we have. And so you count that now, we've got this $1 trillion debt and interest rates have gone up. So you have a bank, I agree, interest rates had to go up by the Bank of Canada to curb inflation. But part of this problem is, our government, the federal government, on multiple levels has made what is a difficult situation worse. They've made it worse by not only their actions, but they've also made it worse by their own behavior. They're at the trough, rewarding themselves. The bank should have said, we're not taking any bonuses or raises this year. I go back to a guy like Frank Stronach at Magna International, one of the most successful industrialists and business people of the last half century in this country. And people used to criticize him because he would get a percentage of the company's earnings, and he was a billionaire. He 1 year, I'm don't quote me on this, Brian, but I think 1 year he made, I don't know, like $40 million. But when the downturn happened, he didn't take any money because he said that's not that we have a constitution and I can't take money because we're not making money. But in government, whether they're making money or not making money, they're giving everybody bonuses. So people, everyday people who are struggling with, an interest rate that goes up, even 1% can cost a family $500 or $600 a month.
We're going to have, because of the interest rate increases, we're going to have a decline in housing prices, and we've got to recognize that what ended up happening is we had a bubble, and the bubble was created by cheap interest, and what ended up happening is a whole bunch of people took advantage of that cheap interest and bought homes that were more expensive and bigger than they probably could otherwise justify in a regular interest rate environment. And so I agree with what you're saying in a impact on people. My concern is that it's going to be bigger. And what we're going to do is we're going to have, there's a good chance that we have a 20%. RBC and BMO have come out just this past week and said they're predicting between a 15 and 20% decrease in housing prices. And that's what should happen because our housing prices have gone up by 30, 40% last year.
Absolutely.
And so therefore people are going to hurt. But when you think about what's happened is we've been the beneficiary of these low interest rates. And we put the government of Canada, the Bank of Canada put in these, number one, these low interest rates, and number two, the deficit spending to get people through the pandemic. And what ended up happening because of that is too many people invested way too much money in the stock market and too much money in housing. Stock market is down 20%. Overall, the tech part of the stock market is down 35%, and they are predictor typically of what goes on in the rest of the economy. And so if that's 20 to 35% decline, that should suggest a dramatic depreciation in housing prices, which is going to impact people even more than you're worried about. What I'm saying is that government and the Bank of Canada should be doing the same thing. And we've got the problem now is that the Bank of Canada is trying to slow down the economy at the same time as Doug Ford is doing the opposite. And it may be politically saleable and it may be smart politics like you say it is, but it's actually not good financial policy. And in the end, the Bank of Canada will have to do even more work to bring the inflationary environment to heed. Anyway, part of the problem is we've actually talked more about the fiscal situation in Canada than the leaders have in the last couple of leadership debates. You know, one of the things is the only guy in the last two leadership debates that was talking about fiscal policy was Maxime Bernier and Erin O'Toole and Andrew Scheer and Justin Trudeau and Jagmeet Singh. They didn't talk about any of this, which is part of the problem, is that we don't have people that are willing to talk about it. We're going to take a break for 2 minutes and come back more with Dan Donovan. And I'm going to ask him about the other big issue that happened this past week, and that is the Pope's visit and what he thinks of both the visit, of the apology, and of the comment that we've had a genocide in Canada. Stay with us, everyone. We'll be back in just 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We got a special Civic Monday. What is actually called? Is it called still Civic Monday? I can't even remember what it's called these days. But anyway, our August long weekend holiday. And I wanted to do a political roundup check-in with Dan Donovan, who is an incredibly interesting guy. He is the editor and publisher of Ottawa Life magazine. He is a former stand-up comic. And I want to come see you do some stand-up comedy sometime, Dan. I think it would be just spectacular. He worked for Frank Stronach in the past. He's been a political staffer on Parliament Hill. And for the last 20 years, he's been running Ottawa Life magazine and publishing some incredibly interesting articles. The cover story in their, I think it was their June edition, was the existential crisis within the Conservative Party. And we had a really interesting conversation about the debate within the Conservative Party about whether it should go populist and right wing or go progressive conservative, which is the historical, I think the historical success of the Conservative Party. Anyway, Dan, let me ask you about the Pope's visit. He made a couple of interesting things, statements. He apologized. People criticized the apology wasn't comprehensive enough. He seemed to increase the apology. And then on the plane, he said it was a genocide. What do you think of the Pope's visit to Canada and what the implications are?
Well, I have mixed feelings about it. I'm a former Catholic. I was baptized Catholic, raised Catholic, like a lot of people my generation. I left the church, the what I call the administration of the church myself. When I was 30, I was upset about the Mount Cashel issue out in Newfoundland, which, as we know, was only the beginning of this pandemic of child abuse in the Catholic Church. Criminality, really. Criminality is what it is, and the cover-ups and the collusion and the church moving priests around, especially in Canada, where they would have these predators, priests in different parishes, and they would sexually assault and abuse, and let's be candid, they would rape children, and then their bishops or the cardinals would know about it, and then they would, instead of turning these priests over to the police, they would move them around to other parishes. There was a place up in Aurora for years, just 2 kilometers from where I used to live, that was a big, it looked like some kind of a vacation spa, but that's where they would send these derelict priests for years to recuperate and to get therapy, so then they could put them back out to commit more crimes. So this is a tragic issue. The abuse that happened, especially in the indigenous communities, is awful. It's generational. There's a lot of pain there. So on the one hand, I think the Pope coming here was good in the sense that they're coming here to apologize. I mean, it's the Pope, the leader of the church in the world, so he's coming to acknowledge these crimes. But it rang a little hollow because, of course, there was no action with it. So we have to be careful, I think, with regards to the victims, because we have to be sensitive to the victims and each of them personally, how they would take that apology. But the problem is that when he came here, he did not offer any financial support to the victims. He did not offer any hope of the police who are investigating these things getting access to Vatican documents that show these crimes occurred and evidence. He did not offer any financial compensation whatsoever to communities affected. And of course, this is on the backs of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, when they made their report, and the Catholic Church, the Catholic Diocese in Canada, promised to give $25 million in compensatory money to victims. And we learned just a couple of years later, they didn't. They gave $3 million. They didn't pay the rest of it. And then they tried this thing, oh, we did that in kind services. We paid some of it in kind services, like by giving counseling and stuff. So it's very problematic. To me, these are criminal acts. There are priests. There's a priest right now living in France who basically went across the Arctic for decades and sexually assaulted children. He's in his 80s now. He's in retirement as a priest in France. He should be immediately detained and sent back to Canada and tried. The Pope has some control over that. Nothing. The Catholic Church in Canada, in my mind, has a lot to account for, and so this comes nowhere close. The bigger problem, though, is in going back to Rome. On his way back, he spoke to some international media, and he said that a genocide had been committed here in Canada with regard to these sexual acts against children. And I think that, from just a legal perspective, was a mistake. I don't think as horrible as everything is that they've done, I don't think it fits the category of genocide. And that's a very serious problem that he's now created for the church and for governments. And I think for historians and other people who are trying to examine this issue and place it where it needs to be placed. But it's horrible and deranged in many things, but I don't think it fits the international rule of law declaration of what a genocide is. And I think that statement by him is problematic and irresponsible.
So let's break this down, because I think there's at least 2 issues here, and they may be overlapping to a certain extent. But I think that the sexual assaults of young people, children, is one issue, and that regrettably didn't happen just in one population, Indigenous people. It happened everywhere around the world. And it's interesting. The Sunday New York Times had a major story and column this week on this issue and called for, in the opinion piece, the end of celibacy in the priesthood, and suggested, and it was interesting. It suggested that the percentage of people that are pedophiles in the regular population is a certain percentage, but it's dramatically greater with the priesthood, and that it was, accepted that if you had that predilection, the priesthood was one of the places that you could go, maybe because you could practice that urging that you had, and or because you were trying to find a way away from it. But for whatever reason, the issue is very prevalent. And it was interesting. They also talked not only about sexual assault of children, but of nuns, and that is the story still to come. But also that it happened around the world. So it's not just something that happened in Canada. It's not just something that happened with Indigenous people. It happened everywhere, and I think we know that. And so what they said is that celibacy is unnatural. It was not something that the Old Testament asked for. It's not something that the New Testament asked for. It's not something that Jesus ever suggested was appropriate. It's something, and it wasn't in the church for numerous centuries. It was something that was put in place later on.
It was actually put in place in the 9th century by the Pope in the 9th century, because the priests had concubines. So they had all these mistresses, and there's a whole history behind this. The priests used to be able to get married prior to that. This is not it's not a law of the Bible. It's certainly not a law of the Scripture. This is a law put in by what I call the administration of the church that has so perverted the church, Brian. And I have many friends who are Catholic, who are still practicing Catholics, who and are wonderful people and are very troubled by all of this. And I think you just hit the nail on the head with what is the problem. And you're absolutely right when you say it didn't just affect Indigenous children. I mean, for me, when I left the church, it was because I was upset about the Mount Cashel case, which were non-Indigenous, young kids in Newfoundland. And when you say it happened around the world, you're absolutely right. So, well, why did it happen around the world? Well, because the Catholic Church was spreading its faith around the world in the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century, and they were building, dioceses and parishes all over the world as people spread in North America and as settlements grew in Australia and everywhere. And so the idea that you could have a celibate priest is unnatural, first of all. But in these communities, the priests had a lot of power. They had just as much power as elected people or a mayor or the head of a city. That with their moral suasion and power, it gave them great influence over people. Yeah. And people trusted priests. They trust them because the Catholicism is you trust and you pray for God and you pray for forgiveness. And so it's that kind of trust that parents would have trust with the people they're confessing to, in the confessional, literally on Sundays. Here are my sins and here's what I've done. And they would tell this priest, so they'd feel a kinship with that priest. And then so they'd put their children with that priest if they had a problem. Well, the priest will bring your children to me and I will help them. And then you'd rape them, because he's a pedophile. This is the problem. So to your point, the problem with the Pope and the problem with this visit is it's all a little much. It's a little late. And if they really wanted to tackle this, they would get rid of the celibacy laws.
Yeah. And the interesting thing,
they don't.
The interesting thing, there are lots of interesting things, but one other interesting thing about this New York Times article was that it didn't actually happen everywhere around the world. It didn't happen in places where the Eastern Rite of the Catholic Church is prevalent, because in the Eastern Rite you can marry, and
yes, that's correct.
And in Protestant churches where you can marry, and their residential schools, you didn't have it. So celibacy, I think, is the issue. However, I think there's a second issue here, and that is this forced assimilation, this desire. And this wasn't just the Catholic Church. I think it was other religions. It was the federal government. It was society potentially in general that didn't believe that Indigenous people really could and should continue their culture. And they were sent to residential schools to try to assimilate them into to Christianity and into the the Westerner way of life. And that is what potentially the Pope was talking about in regards to a cultural genocide, where, I think that he thought, and I think there's a lot of people that think that churches generally, the government, in addition, really were trying to get rid of indigenous culture and assimilate them into Western culture. And I think that's a separate issue. It's not sexual assault, it's racial or cultural assault.
Well, I agree to extent. What I would point out, though, I mean, former Supreme Court Justice Beverly McLaughlin, referred to what happened to indigenous people as a cultural genocide. The problem, and it's a bit, I don't mean to be technical, but it is a sort of a technical legal thing here, because the Pope didn't call it a cultural genocide. He called it a genocide, which has a lot of implications for the Catholic Church. That takes it out of that cultural narrative that you're describing, which I actually agree with, and into something completely different. So I think there's going to be consequences to that. And to your point about indigenous people in this country, I think one of the challenges, and we're seeing it, and I think it's another problem with the government we have today, because in our country, one of the weaknesses in our country is our citizens are not educated in civics and in history. We do not demand enough in our education system for our teachers to teach our children and our students their own history of their own country, of how their government works, of the indigenous issues in this country that have happened with previous governments. We don't teach this in our country. And it just occurred to me, I was recently in Turkey, and I was visiting Ankara, the capital, and I went to a museum there. And it's the Museum for Ataturk, who was the president of Turkey who brought them into their independence in the 1920s. Mustafa Kemal, the great Ataturk, who brought them into true democracy and made Turkey the great country it is today. And I only point this out because there's a shrine to him, like a national monument. It's a museum, like a mausoleum, much like where they have Napoleon in Paris at the museum. But the point is, the day I was there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of school kids. And I was talking to one of the Turkish interpreters, and they said, no, we learn the history of our country. The kids need to know the history. They need to know where they came from. They need to know what happened in our country. And this is a problem in our country, that we don't have people who are knowledgeable about our history generally. So people have all these weird ideas of our history here. But to your point, one of the great things and things we should do in this country is teach people about the tragedy of what's happened to our indigenous people, and the steps taken moving forward, to try to right that wrong, because it's a big wrong.
We're talking tonight with Dan Donovan about a whole bunch of different issues. And the one that we've just been talking about is about whether it's a cultural genocide or whether it's just something incredibly terrible that we collectively have done to our indigenous people. Dan, I can't remember who said it, but someone had said that Abraham Lincoln talked about the original sin of the United States being how they treated their Black people. And the original sin of Canada is how we treated our indigenous people. And so I agree with you. I think it's a massive issue, and we need to educate people about it. We need to do something about it. Anyway, we're going to take a final break and be back in just 2 minutes. And given that it's our civic holiday, I'm going to ask Dan a little bit about one of the big issues that's come up recently about civic politics. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. As usual, I've had a lot of fun arguing with Dan Donovan, who is the Ottawa Life publisher, editor, owner, writer, incredible guy, nice person who's been kind enough to take me to a couple of stand-up comic events and other receptions. And I was kind enough to invite him to a couple of hockey games and got to when we were at Dan, it's civic holiday. And so I got to ask you, so Doug Ford came forward with an interesting policy to make a couple of mayors super mayors and effectively give them a whole bunch more powers than they've had. And I remember chatting with you about how you were very unimpressed with a lot of the things that were happening in council in Ottawa. Does it make sense to give the mayor of Ottawa, the mayor of Toronto, maybe some other mayors, a whole bunch of other powers comparable to, frankly, what mayors in the United States have in some places, not all, and call them super mayors. What do you think of that policy?
You know, it's an interesting question, Brian, and our magazine has written several articles on this, and I actually agree with the move to give, in particular, my understanding that Premier Ford was talking specifically about Toronto and Ottawa, giving the mayors more powers. I think his view on that came from when he was on council with his brother and saw the frustration of that sausage machine and trying to get things done and through in Toronto, where smaller factions can just stop important projects. I think it's the same thing in Ottawa. The mayor here, there's a misperception in Ottawa about the actual authority and powers the mayor has. He can do a lot of stuff by moral suasion and by cajoling things, but he's just like one vote on council. So when things go really wrong, for example, like they did this winter with the complete bizarro show of the lack of police accountability when the truckers took over the city and people were demanding action, the mayor is actually limited in terms of being able to take direct action. So I think there, you know, I look at it more, there has to be some municipal reform to government to make government more effective. I think, and I'm in favor of it as long as there's accountability provisions with it. I don't think you should give mayors unfettered power to do whatever the hell they want. Council still has to play an important role, but I think there are specific areas where you can give the mayor more authority and more power so that, you know, he just can't be stifled and shut down from trying to do things that are in the public interest. And so I thought Ford, I'm still looking at this to see what the specific changes. I want to see the legislative changes he's going to have to bring before the provincial parliament. I'd be interested in seeing those. But generally, the principle of giving the mayor of Toronto and the mayor of Ottawa more power so they could sort of plow through some things to get them done in the public interest, I generally agree with.
You know, it's interesting because you and I have talked before about the power of the PMO, and you've been critical of the power that the PMO has. And that it's too strong. And I think that that's the case in leaders' offices and the PMO's office and the Premier's office. So it's a little bit ironic that we're now talking about strengthening the mayor's office. And mayors are just one vote on council. And so therefore, while they do have the perception of a lot of influence and power, they are only one vote on council, even though they're elected.
And I think the reason for that is precisely because of what you just mentioned, because people think, well, the mayor must have the same kind of power or influence in his government as the prime minister would have in parliament or the premier would have in the province, and they don't. They have one vote on council, so they have to create alliances and they have to keep people, and that means they have to, you know, to do this, they might have to give somebody that, and it's very, very difficult in a city the size of Ottawa or one that's much bigger, Toronto, to try to navigate some things. So I'm not for unfettered power for one person. And again, I think the devil would have to be in the details, because there have to be accountability provisions in that, and there has to be a process. If we give the mayors increased power, then they have to be accountable, and that has to be clearly laid out. How are they accountable?
You know, it's interesting that a couple of councils have actually taken votes and voted against providing their mayors with increased power. And so some councils don't want to give up any power and give it to the mayor. And so they actually disagree with what Premier Ford has been saying. And that, I think, is interesting, that councils disagree, which has got to make some comment about what councils think about whether the mayors deserve that incremental power or not. I personally am not in favor of it. I do think that one of the things that, you and I have talked about this before. I think that cooperation, collaboration, working together takes more time, and it's challenging, but it's actually the right thing to do. And I think that, while we may have difficulty with what the Liberal Party, the NDP, Trudeau and Jagmeet Singh have done, it's the kind of collaboration that, if we had proportional representation, really we would need a lot more of. And I think that
but who killed that? Who killed that? Who killed proportional representation? Justin Trudeau.
So I think proportional representation makes a ton of sense. I think that minority governments have been some of the best governments we've had. I think collaboration and cooperation, working together with different political parties is the right thing to do. And I think if we have first past the post or strengthen PMOs or strengthen mayors, we defeat our system of one vote, one person, one vote. And so I'm actually not in favor of it. But maybe we'll be talking about this in the future. Anyway, that's our show for tonight. Dan Donovan, editor and publisher of Ottawa Life magazine. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been a political sort of roundup for Ontario Civic holiday and holiday for Monday for lots of different provinces across Canada. A real pleasure chatting with you, Dan. I remind everybody I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online from Ottawa at www.saga960am.ca. Have a great holiday, everyone. Have a great week. Good night, everybody. Dan, thank you.
Thank you.